Today we are talking about the most underrated items in Smite. And these items are specifically underrated by casual players or by lower rank players up to mid rank. At some point people catch on, and in competitive you see these items when they're needed, one of them quite frequently. But in lower levels of play you hardly ever see them at all, and I kind of understand why, but at the same time I think that should change. And we're gonna talk about those, so maybe it will change a little bit. The first one is Oni Hunter's Garb. Oni Hunter's Garb is an incredibly cheap item. With 1,900 gold, it's hardly more expensive than hyper-aggressive early game items like Eveline. The difference is that Oni Hunter's Garb is not just an early game item. In fact, in some regards it actually becomes better in late game. I would not be surprised if it sees a price increase very soon. The stats of the item: 100 health, not too much, 60 magical protection, already a pretty good starting value there, 30 MP5, so you will absolutely not run out of mana with this, 20% crowd control reduction, also very beneficial for supports especially, but also for solo laners, and for each enemy guard within 55 units of you, you gain a stack of 3% damage mitigation. This caps at 3 stacks. Now, why is this item so good and why is it so undervalued at the same time? The really strong part about this is A, that it has a good mix of stats overall that provide you a little bit of everything that you can make use of, especially as a support, but again also as a solo, especially with the MP5. It also has damage mitigation, and damage mitigation is, if you can get it cheap, the best defensive stat in the game. Damage mitigation, unless specified otherwise, works against both physical as well as magical damage, but also against true damage. That means you can literally reduce all incoming damage in the game, and that is before anything else is applied. The mitigation gets factored in first when it comes to any incoming damage. The reason why I think most players don't value this item so much is because on one hand it doesn't have any aura, and many people are aware that you should be building defensive auras, but unless an item has that, they think it's probably something that leaves at least something else that makes it worth their while, and in that regard they're often looking for benefits like cooldown reduction, which give you a little bit more aggression or another way of defending others better, and Oni Hunter's Garb doesn't have that either. But that's mostly underestimating the value for money that you get here and heavily underestimating how much mitigation can do for you. Let's look at some examples for this. If we take a Ra and a Chark, and the Chark is the one who has either a magical defense item with an equal value of magical defense to Oni Hunter's Garb, being Talisman of Energy, both 60 magical defense, or that same Chark has Oni Hunter's Garb, then the damage difference is as follows. Ra's one with the Talisman of Energy would deal 108 damage, his 3, let's say 3 ticks, deal 22 damage each, and his ultimate deals 239 damage. So a total of 413 damage. If we instead had Oni Hunter's Garb, then the damage would be 105 for the 1, so a total of 400 damage. That's not a crazy difference yet. That's 13 damage difference. So based on this alone, it doesn't sound like Oni Hunter's Garb is all too impactful, even though it's still pretty cheap and has a lot of good stats. But this is just with one target, so just 3% reduction. The passive goes up to 9% reduction though, if you're against 3 targets. And that can look a lot different. For this example, we're going to take a damage source of 1000 magical damage, then factor in the Oni Hunter's Garb if it is existing, the passive here, the full passive for 3 targets, and then factor in the protections. And then we're gonna see how much magical defense would have to have in addition to the same value as Oni Hunter's Garb in order to make up for the extra mitigation that Oni Hunters provides you with. First, let's look at what mitigation does with the base value. This is theoretically not possible because you can't have the base defense when you have Oni Hunter's Garb, but just for the sake of having a complete picture here. In this case, with Oni Hunter's Garb's passive and your base defense of 48, you would take 614.9 damage. If you had just the base defense, then you would take 675.7 damage. 613.5 magical damage instead, which is basically around the same level as Oni Hunters. Now, if you had 150 protections, the things would look a little bit different already. In this case, you would take 364 damage with Oni Hunter's Garb and 400 without. In order to have a magical defense equal to the passive of Oni Hunter's Garb, you would have to have an extra 25 magical defense, so 175. And keep in mind, you pay a lot for an extra 25 magical defense under most circumstances, with Only Hunter's Garb already being the cheap item to begin with. And then if you were to have 250 magical protections, the same thing would, by the way, work exactly the same way for physical protections, so don't think this is something that's completely unachievable in this context. You would take 260 damage with Only Hunters and 285.7 without. The difference is a bit smaller here, but that is only that case because we're already in very high defense spectrums anyways, and we're taking very low amounts of damage compared to the normal 1000 that we would take without defense. If we were to try and compensate for this damage, then we would have to have an extra 35 protection, so 285 protection in total to reach 259.7 damage taken. So the higher your defense, the more value the damage mitigation gets because it gets applied beforehand. What should be kept in mind here is that at some point health also plays an important role. Only Hunters doesn't have a crazy amount of health, but Only Hunters has something else. The fact that this mitigation does not only work against magical damage or physical damage, but both. You're effectively getting roughly 25 protection each if we're talking about 150 protection. And that is on top of the fact that you also get reduced damage taken from any true damage. The problem with this item, on the other hand, is that obviously it doesn't work the same for everyone, because you have to be in the middle of a fight and reliably get the proc on 2 to 3 people with the passive for it to be really effective. As a support, that's easy. As a solo laner, that's easy. As everyone else, probably not so much. That is why Only Hunter's Garb has this great niche where it can really only be built by tanks, but on them it's super effective as long as you're generally investing into defense and health to make it worth your while. But Only Hunter's Garb is just one of the 2 items that I think is very underrated at the moment. The other one is Celestial Legion Helm. Much like Only Hunters, this item is being built in the SPL, though not as often as Only Hunters, but it does not get the same credit as Only Hunters overall at all on lower levels of play. And that is really strange to me, because if you look at the stats, this item is actually excellent. Sure, it's not the best item if you're looking for raw damage, and there may be better items for a much higher price if you're looking into stacking that may be a little bit better in late game. But for the price and for what it overall offers, I think this item is absolutely fantastic and is kind of what replaces a Dynasty playtime. The stats for 2050 gold are 60 magical power, 40 physical protection and plus 20 MP5. So in terms of sustaining, you get a lot of MP5 and you also have a little bit extra damage with 60 magical power, which shouldn't be undervalued either. The big deal is the passive though. Every 2 seconds you receive a stack of 10 physical protection, up to a max of 5 stacks. Stacks are removed upon taking physical damage from gods, and by the way, the stacks are removed one by one, not all at once. Stacks can only be gained after not taking physical damage from gods for 5 seconds. So that means, after 10 seconds, if you let this item stack, you will have a total of 90 physical protection, with items normally going up to 70 physical protection. And that is from a 2050 gold item, so not very expensive at all. But how much damage difference is that really when you're getting hit? For that, we take a level 10 Apwash versus a level 10 Thor. In this case, we're using Thor's abilities 1 and 3, which already have a lot of ticks to take down the protections from this item step by step. And with Thor, you would normally take 529 damage if you don't have any defense. If you had Midgardian Mail, a single physical defense item with the same defense as Celestial Legion without any stacks, then the total damage that you would take would be 412. So you would already reduce the damage by 117, even if Celestial Legion didn't have any stacks at all. But with the stacks slowly being chunked away over time, the total damage that you would take after his full 3 as well as his 1 and the return damage of the 1 would be 347. So your overall damage taken is reduced by 182, or very roughly 1/3 of the damage. And this only gets better against physical gods that have hard-hitting single abilities and not that many ticks. So Thor is already a scenario that is not quite as favorable as some others. As such, this item is great in many situations. It's great if you're playing a magical ADC against a physical ADC, or a magical mid laner against a physical mid laner, for example a hunter lane. It's great against a high aggression assassin in the jungle that will go against you specifically. And it's great when you're playing a bit of a bruiser mage and you want a good mix of damage and a lot of defense. It is by far the easiest way to get a lot of heavy physical defense, and unless you're against multiple physical characters that focus you specifically, it should greatly increase your survivability. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this gave you a good overview of these two items that I think are criminally underrated. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to click the like, maybe the sub button and the bell if you're not subscribed yet, it really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.